to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola. My name is Nancy Hagman, and I will be your service leader today. We will start with a few announcements. There is a piece of jewelry that we have found in someplace we found this jewelry. I have no idea where. And it was turned into the office, and if it stays in the office hidden, it will probably never be worn again. So if there's a piece of jewelry that you remember having that you no longer own, you might want to check and see if this one's yours. A couple of other announcements. There are a couple of petitions in the foyer for getting a couple things on the ballot. One of them is about clean water, and the other one is about abortion and women's rights. You can be in any county and sign those so they are not restricted to one county or the other. So please fill them out if you're so inclined to do that. We have another announcement about second hour for the next 2 or 3 weeks. We have some exciting things happening. Next week we will be talking about a vote on the 8th principle. And the information, I'm going to read this so that I don't miss any details, but stay after the service next week. And we, as you remember, we discussed the 8th principle at our annual congressional meeting in May, but the motion to adopt was tabled to allow further discussion. Well, as you used to, further discussion has happened. On June 4th, a committee, as always, got together and decided on a couple of versions, and those have been printed, and you can read those versions. They will be presented next week, and you also can choose not to adopt it at all. If you cannot attend, you may join by Zoom, or you can email your vote to Laura Keith King, by noon on Saturday, and your vote will be counted. The Lunch Bunch is meeting. They are meeting this week on Wednesday at Kingfisher at 1 o'clock, and Hugh Ed Turner is the connection for that. And you are welcome to join that group and have lunch together. On July the 23rd, I told you we have second hour for a couple of weeks. Next week will be the vote. On the 23rd, Paula Montgomery will provide a PowerPoint on the laws that were passed during the most recent legislative session. It's important for us to be able to stay abreast of what's happened in our congressional level. And to do that, we need to know what has already passed and how it will affect us and our neighbors and our friends. Childcare has been arranged, so please plan to attend. It will be an excellent presentation, and it will clarify I don't know if I should say sadly clarify or clearly clarify, but anyway, it will clarify some details perhaps that you may not have known. And in the calendar year, August the 6th, we're going to celebrate with a potluck. It is actually the first of the seasonal gatherings of gathering food. August, September, October, November, those are the times of the harvest. And on the pagan calendar, around the 1st of August is the first gathering. I myself have always remembered that we had when I lived in cooler country, an influx of tomatoes to where we actually could play with them and throw them because there were so many. So think of ideas for celebrating with a local harvest. Fruits and vegetables from your garden, locally sourced foods such as fruits, nuts, or vegetables that are grown locally, seafood caught locally, chickens or eggs that are raised locally. So think in advance, that would be August the 6th. If you are visiting for the first time, we do not have a program or an order of service that we hand out, but we do have a folder that tells you a little bit about us and a written statement or two about how we work and what we do in this congregation. And now we will have a visual of our 7 principles, and then that will be followed by centering music. It's called My Roots Go Deep, My Roots Go Down. As the words and/or images to this song appear on the screen, if in fact they do, you may choose to either sing along, to ground yourself, and to feel the strength flowing through your body. Our opening words and the lighting of the chalice. The Chalice is a Symbol by Deborah Falk. A chalice lit in our midst is a symbol of our liberal faith, a faith built on the foundation of freedom, reason, and tolerance, a faith sustained by acts of kindness and justice, a faith that visions a world flourishing with equality for all her people, a faith that demands the living out of goodness, a faith that requires thoughtfulness, a faith of wholeness. This tiny flame is the symbol of the spark of all this within each of us. And now if you'll stand, we'll recite the covenant in body or spirit. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And if you'll remain standing and find that little turquoise book, as you bend down, use your knees and your elbows and your hips to fold up to find that little turquoise book. And you can turn to page 1051, and the choir will lead us in the opening hymn.
all the storms knocked the internet out and the YouTube videos are not loading. But I had selected a story for our Time for All Ages, which is called Pearl Moskowitz's Last Stand by Arthur Levine. And if you, I'm going to briefly share what the story is about for our Time for All Ages, and of course you can go and look it up and find it. It's a really nice little book. Essentially in the story, the Moskowitz family had moved to this street at a time when there were a lot of German and Polish neighbors that also lived around them, and they were working class people, and they wanted to beautify their neighborhood, and so they petitioned the city where they were to put some ginkgo trees along the street so that they would have shade and that they would have beautiful things to look at. And they eventually got that to happen. So Pearl Moskowitz's mother actually did that. And they put in these beautiful trees, and the neighbors would meet under them, and they would play games, and they would have parties and picnics and things like that. And as the neighborhood began to change, with different families moving into the neighborhood, the city came and wanted to do some expansion of the street, and they tore down a bunch of the trees. And ultimately, there was only one tree remaining. And by this time, Pearl Moskowitz had lived on the street her whole life. From the time she was a young girl, her mother and father had passed away, and now she was there with her own family and the neighbors that were there. And they still met and played games and did things, but only under the one ginkgo tree. So the city came one day and said that they were going to tear the tree down. And Pearl said, I won't let that happen. This was put here by my mother, and we've done everything we can to make our neighborhood beautiful and to enjoy where we live. And she actually chains herself to the tree, and the folks come to cut the tree down, and the neighbors ply the man that's coming to cut it down with food. They just keep bringing him latkes and enchiladas and sandwiches and coffee and all these things that they made. And he finally says, okay, I'm not going to cut the tree down. And they end up changing the name of the street to Moskowitz Street at the end. So it's a really nice little story about taking a stand for something that's important to you. It would have been much nicer to hear it from the video than from me. And we can sing the children out.
And we'll sing the children out. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Before we do our offering or pass the baskets, I'd like for you to take a moment. And if you want to, you're welcome to shut your eyes. And if you are not here in this building today, and this congregation did not exist, where would you be? What would you be doing? When you needed to know something, you needed to know something about someone else, or you needed help from someone else, who would you call? How would you let them know? Would it be a part of this congregation? Did you come today because of the people? Did you even know the name of the topic? Or did the topic bring you? What does it feel like to sit in this room silently with those around you? When have you ever felt their support? Physically? Emotionally? Maybe even financially? So possibly why we're here is because of the people. May it be so. So we pass the offering. It is a representative of what keeps the building alive, and our activities alive, but it is much more than that. And I encourage you to share what you can, to share if you pledge, to share if you don't, and take time to understand what it is you're giving to, and who you're giving it to, and what you're giving it for. Blessed be. And we're hoping that we have a connection to the internet, or at least have this video. This is an excellent video, and it is Let Justice Roll Down, performed by Lee Morris, and the words are by Eileen Vance.
Nancy says, I'm leaving, so it's your turn. So unfortunately, we don't get to hear the wonderful song, but some of you will recognize the line, which is a reference to the scripture that says, let justice roll down like a mighty river and righteousness like a stream, something, I think. I didn't have that written down, but that was going to kind of set the scene for what I'm going to be speaking about today. It's great to see everybody out there. So you will remember just 2 weeks ago I was here and I spoke in the first part of a 3-part series looking at our UUCP mission statement, which is to celebrate diversity, strive for justice, and inspire love. The good news is today I'm speaking about strive for justice, but you don't have to hear from me again for another month. So it's not until August 13th that I speak about inspire love. It just so happened that the other two fell 2 weeks apart. We did one each month in June, July, and August. I want to mention as well that I'm going to reference some books and articles that are very appropriate, and I have printed out a reading guide, like just a couple suggested things. If you like some of the books and articles that I mentioned, you may want to follow up and read them as well, and I would recommend y'all doing that. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to discuss our religious traditions of working for justice. I will identify some injustices present in our current moment, and will share ideas and examples of striving for justice even when justice seems elusive. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. This verse from the Old Testament, Micah 6:8, is commonly cited in Jewish and Christian communities to compel people to act in times of injustice. The well-known line is said to have been a message delivered by God to the prophet Micah. Micah was active in a small agricultural town southwest of Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE. Micah is notable for having ministered to common people and for prophesying judgment against corrupt leaders of the time. We have some of those, right? In the words of one text interpretation, the leaders practiced and tolerated false doctrine that led to a false understanding of the character of God, and as a result, injustice toward the lowly, mistreatment of women and children, unjust business practices, and exploitation of the poor, many of whom were rural dwellers like Micah. The rich were living in luxury, while the marginalized suffered to pay for extravagances for those in power. Again, we can relate to these things, which is why this scripture comes up so often. Micah warned these leaders and the people that in the face of injustice, exploitation, racism, and mistreatment of certain populations, they were not doing what they needed to do. They were not acting with righteousness, equity, and morality. They were not being just. So Micah's text is used as a call to action to people of the book to not be silent or complacent when others, especially people who are vulnerable, are abused, mistreated, in need, scorned, or exploited. So those of us who are in this congregation have participated in Just Pensacola events, and we've likely heard this text there because Micah 6:8 is used as a motto for the work of Just Pensacola, which is an interfaith coalition whose acronym stands for Justice United Seeking Transformation in our area. The purpose of the organization, in their own words, is to actively uncover injustice and mobilize people of faith to create and win just, fair, and effective solutions from decision makers. Considering that there are hundreds of Christian churches alone in Pensacola and the surrounding area, one might think that there'd be dozens of congregations involved with Just Pensacola to live out the religious mandate of Micah 6:8. Well, there are 17 committed member congregations, which includes both Jewish temples in town, numerous Christian denominations, and of course UUCP. One of the local mosques also has been involved with the effort, but is not an official member of the group at this time. Just Pensacola is intentionally multiracial and utilizes a shared leadership model. In the handful of years of its existence, the organization has made a significant contribution to this community merely by pushing the conversation about these justice issues among people of faith. The congregations involved have mobilized hundreds of folks who otherwise likely would not have gotten involved in political activism of this kind. The work of Just Pensacola and its member congregations keeps with the legacy of religiously liberal faith traditions, including Unitarianism and Universalism, striving for justice. According to an article on the history of progressivism published by the Center for American Progress, many of the most prominent social movements in American progressive history would not have been possible without the inspirational values and moral authority of socially conscious Christianity and Judaism. The social gospel movement and Catholic social teaching played influential roles in the progressive search for economic fairness and justice in the 20th century. Proponents of the social gospel, whose names you may recognize and see on the slide here, are settlement founders Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, Catholic worker Dorothy Day, and later the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. UUs recognize these folks and many more among the prophetic people who challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love, in the words of our 6 sources of wisdom and spirituality. And I think most of these folks are also included in our hymnal with readings that we have used in our congregation. Related to the social gospel movement is liberation theology, which arose in late 20th century Roman Catholicism and was centered in Latin America. To quote from Britannica, liberation theology sought to apply religious faith by aiding the poor and oppressed through involvement in political and civic affairs. It stressed both heightened awareness of the sinful socioeconomic structures that caused social inequities and active participation in changing these structures. Meanwhile, Black liberation theology emerged out of the 1960s civil rights activism to address the Black experience in the United States in particular. Reverend James Cone is the founder of Black liberation theology, which is inspired by both Dr. King and Malcolm X. Reverend Cone comes from the African Methodist Episcopal faith tradition. Cone explains the Black liberation theology movement as, quote, mainly a theology that sees God as concerned with the poor and the weak, end quote. Terry Gross of the NPR show Fresh Air conducted an interview with Reverend Cone in 2008. In the interview, Cone explained that at the core of Black liberation theology is an effort in a white-dominated society in which Black has been defined as evil to make the gospel relevant to the life and struggles of American Blacks and to help Black people learn to love themselves. In Jewish teachings, the concept of tikkun olam, translated from Hebrew into English as repairing of the world, refers to various forms of action intended to repair and improve our society. Bear with me as I quote from Wikipedia here, which is something academics are never supposed to do. In classical rabbinic literature, the phrase tikkun olam referred to legal enactments intended to preserve the social order. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the repair is mystical, to return the sparks of divine light to their source by means of ritual performance. In the modern era, particularly among the post-Haskalah movements, tikkun olam has come to refer to the pursuit of social justice or the establishment of godly qualities throughout the world, based on the idea that Jews bear responsibility not only for their own moral, spiritual, and material welfare, but also for the welfare of society at large. So I would be remiss not to acknowledge that the social gospel movements, the liberation movements, and the Jewish social justice proponents were and are seeking to repair and restore disorder and to heal pain, trauma, and injustice that was originally wrought at the hands of people, states, and institutions that also espoused strongly held religious beliefs and who claimed that they also were acting out religious mandates, which involved dispossession, death, and destruction. Religious texts had been used to justify many viewpoints and actions, often competing ones. Some would say that the texts were being corrupted and misused when they were held up as imperatives for campaigns of dispossession, death, and destruction, and that the teachings, in fact, speak more to humanity, justice, and equity. There is not just one model for spiritual life, and the authoritarian religious model that we often see today has not always been and does not have to always be. It is empowering to learn and become familiar with these religious leaders for justice of earlier days. It is affirming to recognize that our religious traditions of working for justice run deep. Faith movements have been involved in activism to free folks from bondage of many types, including slavery, prison, poverty, intimate partner violence, and labor exploitation. Abortion rights and reproductive freedom also have been causes taken up by religious organizations, and not just UUs. If you had a chance to watch the 2022 HBO documentary The Janes, which I highly recommend, you may have been surprised, like I was, to learn about the Clergy Consultation Service, a network of religious leaders who helped thousands of women find safe, comfortable ways of having an abortion. Also I learned through this documentary about the evolution and the revelation that the Southern Baptists of the 1960s and 70s favored at least some abortion access. From a 2015 article by the Baptist Press, quote, when the Supreme Court legalized abortion on demand in 1973 with its Roe v. Wade decision, some Southern Baptists criticized the ruling while maintaining their support of abortion rights as defined in the 1971 resolution. Others embraced the Supreme Court's decision. A Baptist Press analysis article written by then Washington Bureau Chief Barry Garrett declared that the court had, quote, advanced the cause of religious liberty, human equality, and justice, end quote. Today, the organization, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, continues to advocate for reproductive freedom on the grounds of religious values. RCRC, as the group is known, describes itself as a multi-faith, intersectional, and anti-racist movement for reproductive freedom and dignity, leading in spiritual companionship, curating frameworks for faith leaders, and training the next generation of activists. Some of you will remember that a beloved friend of this congregation, Tom Brown, who was a retired Methodist minister, was an avid supporter of RCRC and a regular escort at the women's clinic to help folks safely seek care at that facility when it was still open. There was a concerted effort within the Southern Baptist denomination starting in the 1980s to move the denomination in a more conservative direction regarding abortion rights. A Southern Baptist minister named Larry Lewis reported picking up a copy of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper in 1979 and seeing a full-page ad listing the Southern Baptist Convention among denominations that affirmed the right to abortion. Lewis said, quote, right there beside the Unitarians and Universalists was the Southern Baptist Convention. That bothered me a lot. Can you imagine? The Southern Baptists went on to adopt multiple anti-abortion statements, to lobby for anti-abortion legislation, and to become the key player in that movement that it is today. As the Southern Baptists shifted, the dominant religious messages on important political and social issues also have come increasingly from the religious right and from right-wing evangelicals, rather than from the social gospel proponents or liberation theologists who were so active in the late 1800s and throughout the 1900s. In his book, Reclaiming Prophetic Witness, Paul Razor writes, religious liberals seem to have moved into the background of public life or disappeared altogether. Razor, a UU minister and author of numerous books, goes on to write, religiously grounded social justice work has declined among religious liberals. Religious liberals have been far less likely than members of other religious groups to support any form of activism or speaking out on public issues by their clergy or denominational leaders, and they have been less likely to engage in most forms of political participation. There are relevant explanations for this decline in faith-based justice work among religious liberals. Razor writes, mistrust of religious dogma and openness to diverse theological traditions, while generally a positive trait, can leave religious liberals uncertain about how to relate their faith commitments to their social and political commitments. So just think about it. When you're not a religious evangelical who views everything through a particularly religious lens, it can be tough to speak about beliefs and values using religious language. The religious right has no such qualms, however, and they have made causes such as attacking reproductive rights, women's rights, LGBTQIA+ rights, and the rights of people of color central to their religious crusade. Religious discourse on social issues over the last several decades not only has come increasingly from the religious right rather than the religious left. Religious discourse on social issues has become increasingly, unceasingly authoritarian and nationalistic. The headline of this article from a publication called U.S. Catholic warrants serious consideration. The headline is, any religion allied with nationalism is dangerous. Religious nationalism is not merely a Christian issue. Religious nationalism is present in the form of Hindu nationalism in India, Turkish Islamic nationalism in Turkey, and Buddhist nationalism in Burma, among others. In these cases, nationalism at the hands of the religious group involves acts such as imprisonment of dissenters, destruction of religious sites, marginalization of minorities, even rape and murder. For this talk, I'm focusing on the U.S. and Christian nationalism. The U.S. Catholic article describes a U.S. study conducted in February of this year by Public Religion Research Institute. The study is titled, Understanding the Threat of Christian Nationalism in American Democracy and Culture. The poll found that 29% of Americans are sympathetic to Christian nationalism, which involves three tenets. 1, that the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. 2, that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. And 3, that the U.S. should not be a nation made up of people belonging to a variety of religions. Sympathizers and adherents of Christian nationalism support the notion of an authoritarian leader, which means, quote, a leader who is willing to break some rules if that's what it takes to get things right, unquote. More than 8 in 10 Christian nationalist adherents agreed with the following statement: God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that could be an example to the rest of the world. It is appropriate to clarify, if you haven't already caught on, that what I'm talking about here is not just some general Christian nationalism, but this is white Christian nationalism. The statement about God's intentions for European Christians should sound familiar. In so many words, this is the 19th century doctrine of manifest destiny, which is the assertion that the white supremacist colonial expansion of the U.S. throughout the American continent was both justified and inevitable, thanks to divine providence, as illustrated in this lovely painting. We can easily discern that white Christian nationalism is antithetical to justice work in the spirit of the social gospel, liberation theology, tikkun olam, and our UU principles. Our humanistic traditions embrace the full worth of humanity and value of all people. And our pluralistic values oppose extremism in favor of engagement, openness, and inclusion of diverse groups, as I discussed in my previous talk on celebrating diversity. Likewise, the international nature of many faith traditions encourages us to think beyond national boundaries and to embrace our global siblings and their experiences as bound up with ours in our interdependent web of life. This message of internationalist solidarity is epitomized in the hymn, This Is My Song, one of my favorite UU songs from our hymnal. The lyrics refer to the God of all the nations as we sing a song of peace for lands afar and mine. The writer recognizes that other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. The authoritarian white Christian nationalist movement has erupted in the last 15 years or so in direct opposition to many decades of justice work to secure rights and representation for historically marginalized groups. UU Minister Reverend Cecilia Kingman contextualizes the rise of authoritarianism in her exemplary essay, My Little Pony Was Right, Reflections of Fascism Without and Within. In the essay, Kingman invokes the work of Jason Stanley, a professor and scholar who is the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Kingman in her essay writes, quote, fascists tell people that equality is victimizing them by making them lose their rightful place or power. Stanley says the goal to make people feel like victims, to make them feel like they've lost something and that the thing they've lost has been taken from them by a specific enemy, usually some minority outgroup or some opposing nation. According to Edgeris Dixon, writing in Truth Out, fascists believe that democracy has failed them and allowed the majority to be tyrannized by communities that have no right to power. Therefore, fascists seek to eliminate both democratic processes and marginalized communities to return to an often fictitious and glorified past where their power reigned unchecked. So let me be honest, things have gotten pretty bad, as we just heard. As a nation, our commitment to pluralistic democracy and equity seems to have peaked some years ago and been on a downturn since, from my point of view. Like climate change, the danger is multiplying at an exponential rate. But there is really no sense in bemoaning the current state of affairs and being inactive. We are still here, we are still alive, and we stand on the shoulders of many giants who have resisted similar turns and far worse. That said, I want to share some examples and ideas of justice work that we UUs can engage with, even when justice seems elusive. In the words of activist scholar Angela Davis, we're never assured of justice without a fight. As UUs, we know what it means to fight for justice. Social justice work is important to us. Hence, we here at UUCP included striving for justice in our congregational mission statement. And what I like about the phrase is that it is aspirational. We are striving for justice, and this is an ongoing process. UUs and Unitarians and Universalists before the merger have been religious movements that have wedded social justice work to theology. Our second and our sixth principles underscore the importance of justice in our relations and broader communities. The Unitarian Universalist Association, or UUA, notes on its social justice page that many people have come to UU congregations first and foremost because of our liberal voice in the community on important issues. I know that was true for me and for Scott. So let's turn back to Paul Razor in his book, Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. Razor writes that even while many religious liberals were less likely to engage in the public sphere over the last several decades, Unitarian Universalist clergy have remained a highly activist dynamo of the left in contemporary American politics by translating their theology into social and political activism. Razor cites the Side with Love campaign as one example of this activism. Thousands of UUs have shown up over the years in bright yellow t-shirts to participate in a variety of activities, such as protests against unjust immigration policies in Arizona and demonstrations against the white supremacists who converged on Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 for the Unite the Right rally, which resulted in the death of Charlottesville local 32-year-old Heather Heyer and the injury of 19 other people when a white supremacist intentionally drove into the crowd. You can see in the photo here that our then UUA president, Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray, was present and in solidarity with other faith leaders during the march in Charlottesville. Her yellow Side with Love stole is clearly visible in the picture. Frederick Gray has been notable for her persistent presence in justice work even before she was elected to the presidency of the UUA. Frederick Gray followed in the footsteps of other justice-minded UUs before her, including the civil rights martyr Reverend James Reeb, shown here walking in the pivotal Selma to Montgomery March with Dr. Ralph Abernathy and his children, and Dr. King and Coretta Scott King in 1965, not long before Reeb was beaten to death by white supremacists for this very work. Reeb's legacy continues in the form of a UU congregation that bears his name, as well as voting rights campaigns and education projects. Frederick Gray just concluded her 6-year term with the UUA and was succeeded by Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who ran unopposed and was elected at the UU General Assembly last month. Betancourt serves as resident scholar and special advisor on justice and equity at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which we mainly know from the little boxes we get at the end of the year to donate. And she's expected to follow through with the UUA's justice initiatives. One such initiative on the national scale has been the Poor People's Campaign, begun in 2018 by Reverend William Barber. You might recall that in 2013, Barber had helped to organize Moral Mondays, weekly protests at the North Carolina legislature led by religious progressives, demanding gun safety measures and an end to discriminatory laws. UUs were a part of that work as well. The current Poor People's Campaign has carried forward the economic justice work begun by Dr. King in 1968 before his assassination. According to their website, the campaign is uniting people across the country to challenge the evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. While there is not a physical chapter here in our area, the organization has held online rallies, teach-ins, and events to educate and mobilize folks like ourselves and to advocate for legislation and civil action. Locally, there are several organizations that are addressing the recent book bannings in Escambia County and other school zones that have targeted materials portraying characters of color, LGBTQ characters, and storylines that depict a diversity of lived experiences. Many of you have probably heard that a lawsuit has been filed against the school district on First Amendment grounds. The plaintiffs in the suit include PEN America, a writers group, Penguin Random House, a publishing company, and local parents and students, including Scott and Desmond. Another plaintiff in the lawsuit is the organization Protect Democracy, whose website declares, "Our democracy is in danger. The 250-year American experiment in self-government is threatened by a global rise in authoritarianism. Together we can preserve democracy for future generations." Another group working on this issue is Florida Freedom to Read Project, which works to defend students' rights to access library materials. The group gave away copies of banned books during the recent Pensa Pride Festival. Another nonprofit that many of us are familiar with and support, Open Books, also gave away free banned books at the festival and regularly distributes books of all kinds to other nonprofit groups, fills area little free libraries, and sends books for free to Florida prisoners, which has been the organization's mission for more than 20 years. Another local group is the Pensacola Abortion Rights Task Force, or PART. The group formed just a few months ago in response to the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. PART has held several educational events, including a screening of the film The Janes that I mentioned earlier, has organized rallies to demonstrate local support for choice, gives away reproductive items such as pregnancy tests and Plan B pills, and is currently working with multiple other entities to collect signatures for the Abortion on the Ballot initiative to place the issue on the 2024 ballot so that Florida voters have the option to decide about abortion access rather than leaving these decisions to legislators. We have the petitions here in our lobby, as Nancy mentioned earlier. I invite anyone who hasn't already filled one out to fill it out if they're moved to do so. I've already also mentioned Just Pensacola, which has been working on housing and criminal justice issues, and we continue in these efforts with our upcoming conversations that should be beginning in the fall. We're an active member of that organization. Finally, I want to circle back to the essay that I discussed earlier by Reverend Kingman. Kingman delivered the essay, My Little Pony Was Right, at this year's UU Minister Association's annual Berry Street Conference in June. And the essay is the springboard for 2 upcoming online workshops about understanding and combating fascism in our lifetime. The word fascism is thrown around a lot these days, and not always in a reasoned way. Kingman takes great pains in her essay to explain her reasoning for using the word. These webinars will provide us with an opportunity to more fully understand how we got to the point that we are currently at so that we can fight authoritarianism in a strategic and effective way. And it is essential that we do so. This was announced in the most recent weekly email and is also posted on our website, how to register for the workshops. In the words of the philosopher and political activist Dr. Cornel West, a Christian and a religious progressive, justice is what love looks like in public. May we as UUs show up in the public sphere with our love, our faith, and our work for justice constantly on display. May we be visible and persistent. May we be visible and persistent in our strive for justice. Thank you.
If you will rise for our closing hymn, number 1017 in the turquoise hymnal, and we will sing with the choir. Build a New Way, 10:17.
Way.
Our closing words are excerpted from a speech by Ella Baker, an unappreciated grassroots community organizer, considered by some to be the mother of the civil rights movement. Baker delivered this speech at the Freedom Day rally in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in January of 1964, nearly 60 years ago. Her words are still relevant today, and they are: "The cause to me is bigger than any organization, bigger than any group of people, and it is the cause of humanity, the drive of the human spirit for freedom. We are just beginning the freedom struggle. Let me tell you why. Because even tomorrow, if every vestige of racial discrimination were wiped out, if all of us became free enough to go down and to associate with all the people we wanted to associate with, we still are not free. We aren't free until within us we have that deep sense of freedom. People cannot be free until they realize that peace is not the absence of war or struggle. It is the presence of justice. People cannot be free until there is enough work in this land to give everyone a job. Until we recognize that in this country, of great plenty and great wealth, there are millions of people who go to bed hungry every night. Unless we see this thing in its larger perspective, unless we realize that certainly we must sing, we also must have the information that comes from lots and lots of study, access to information and to representation. We are going to have to be concerned about the kinds of education our children are getting in school for the freedom of the American spirit. The freedom which we seek is a larger freedom that encompasses all humankind. And until that day, we will never turn back. Blessed be, go in peace.